If God is speaking to all of you, then he appears to be telling all of you very different, contradictory things. Perhaps this rather glaring discrepancy can be explained if we examine the fact that your relationship with God seems to be precisely shaped by the culture in which you were raised and the predominant version of God you were taught to believe in. Sure, there are exceptions, but typically religion obeys borders.
You serious?
12, I think this is a slight improvement, what I call the bare counterfactual argument on slide 12. So there again, we start with just the counterfactual as the premise, and then in the conclusion, we're trying to conclude not that the religious beliefs are false, but just that you don't know that they're true. And so maybe the problem here is a lack of justification. The beliefs could be true, but even if they were true, it wouldn't really count as knowledge. You would be right just by luck, by a sheer accident of birth. So that's one way of interpreting the argument, and when you read the text, it kind of looks like what people are up to. They just give you the counterfactual, and then they say, time for a hermeneutic of suspicion, time to give up our religious beliefs. And this is how Alvin Plantinga interprets John Hick's argument. Plantinga responded to John Hick's religious pluralism in a 1995 article. And it seems like Plantinga thinks Hick is reasoning in this way. And Plantinga gives a really good counterexample, as he does. He points out that this sort of counterfactual doesn't always show that we lack knowledge. After all, he says, I'm going to adapt it to my own case. I believe that I was born in Long Beach, California, and I think it's pretty obvious that I know I was born in Long Beach, California. But now consider this kind of skeptical argument. What if I had been born and raised elsewhere? Else when? Wouldn't I have different beliefs about where I was born? Yeah, probably. So does it follow then that I don't know where I was born? No, that doesn't follow. So that was Plantinga's counterexample of this sort of argument. And then he also gives what philosophers call a tu quoque, which is a fancy way of saying right back at you, or you too. This applies to you too. He points out that John Hick's religious pluralism is such that if John Hick had been born somewhere else and at some other time, he wouldn't have been a religious pluralist. And so by John Hick's own lights, doesn't it follow then that John Hick doesn't know that religious pluralism is true? And more generally, like whatever you believe about religion, even if you're a skeptic, even if you're an atheist, isn't it true that if you were born in Pakistan, you'd be a Muslim? If you'd been born in medieval France, you would have been a Catholic? So this argument looks like it applies to everybody. And so you might wonder how the religious skeptic would respond to that sort of thing. And if you go to slide 14, you can see John Hick's response. He says, this is true that if Hick had been born at another time in another place, he wouldn't have been a pluralist. But how relevant is it, John Hick says? One is not usually a religious pluralist as a result of having been raised from childhood to be one, as in most cases, one is raised from childhood to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu. And so I think what John Hick is saying here is the problem isn't just that if I had been born somewhere else and then at another time I would have had different religious beliefs. The problem is that what this counterfactual shows is the way in which I formed my religious beliefs was a bad way. It's a way that easily could have led me into error. It easily could have led me to believe false things. And the way that he has in mind is something like what Descartes calls acquiring your religious beliefs by custom and example. Or John Hick says it's having your religious beliefs instilled into you from childhood. Or it's what Philip Kitcher calls early teaching and socialization. So I think what the religious skeptic has in mind is if your religious beliefs came about in that way, you believe them just because somebody told you, then you don't really know that they're true. And so when you try to use this argument on the religious skeptic's going to say, well, that's not how I formed my religious beliefs. I formed my religious beliefs by really thinking about it and considering arguments and evidence. But then I think the obvious worry is that you can see it right here on slide 14 in the little parenthetical remark that Hick has in his quote. He says, in most cases, people form their religious beliefs because they were just raised to hold those religious beliefs. In most cases. I don't know if he did any sort of empirical studies to know whether that's true, but it seems pretty clear that he would let reflective religious believers off the hook. If you're a reflective religious believer who has formed religious beliefs on the basis of argument and evidence, well, this argument's not going to apply to you anymore.
And that really actually struck me as I was reading your paper, because you say that like anybody reading this paper basically would count as a reflective,
I think so. Well, yeah, I mean, he's got a dilemma. Like, how strict do you want to be about reflectiveness? If you want to be really strict and say, no, you've got to actually get like a PhD in philosophy or something to count as reflective, well, then the argument will apply to a lot of religious skeptics who haven't been that reflective. If, on the other hand, you want to be really generous about reflection so that religious skeptics virtually all count as reflective, as long as they've thought about it pretty hard, well, now a whole lot of religious believers are going to count as reflective. Certainly anybody who reads a paper like mine, or any paper at all like mine, anybody who listens to podcasts like yours would count as reflective. So he's never really clear about what would count as reflective. But again, I think either way you go, there's a sort of cost for his argument. And so that's what I say on slide 15. You can avoid planning as counterexamples if you appeal to methods, and you say the problem with religious believers is the method that they're using. They're just sort of passively receiving beliefs from their parents or from their teachers. So you can avoid planning as counterexamples that way, but then the cost is there are a lot of religious believers who don't form their beliefs in that way, and they're all off the hook. So I think maybe a better way forward for the religious skeptic is on slide 16 there. I think what they have in mind, at least when they're targeting unreflective religious believers, what they're trying to say is unreflective religious believers are using a bad method when they form their religious beliefs. Again, it's early teaching and socialization, just accepting what their parents and teachers told them. But then I think you can even question that skeptical argument. You can say, what's so bad about this bad method? And I think what they probably mean, as you'll see on slide 16 there, is the problem with early teaching and socialization, or just learning your religious beliefs by custom and example, is that this method is what philosophers call insensitive to the truth. It's an unsafe method, or if it happened to get you a true belief, your belief would be true just by accident. And on slide 17, I'll give your viewers a little definition of all those. Is that your son in the background?
Yeah, I actually had my mic muted, but yeah, he just walked in. He's I was mentioning
Oh,
before.
sorry, man.
Yeah, no worries. I mentioned before the show started that he's not feeling well, so we had to go. My wife just went and got him and brought him home, but yeah, no worries, no worries.
So on slide 17 there, you can see some definitions of those philosophical terms. And I mean, here's one way to put my worry. What the skeptic is saying is that the testimony of your parents and your teachers is sort of a bad way of learning about the world. And you might wonder whether that's always true, because, gosh, we learn an awful lot from our parents and our teachers, you know? If that was really a bad way to learn about the world, we're in some serious hot water. And we rely on others for testimony all the time. I mean, even when you read like a scientific journal, you're just getting testimony from other scientists. And so when you start realizing that what they have in their crosshairs here is knowledge by way of testimony, you might start thinking that there's something fishy here. And I think that's right. So I think what they're saying is, if you just passively believe what your parents told you when you were a kid, then your belief was formed insensitively, which means even if the belief had been false, you still would have held it. So the method that you're using doesn't really track the truth. You hope that it's telling you the belief is true because it really is true. But what if it were false? Would it still tell you it was true? And the idea is, yeah, it would still tell you it was true. Or maybe what they mean is the method was unsafe, which basically just means unreliable, like doesn't tend to give you true beliefs, doesn't give you mostly true beliefs. If you were to use this method, you easily might believe falsely. Or what they mean is something like what Dawkins said when he realized that his religious beliefs, if they were true, would be true by a sheer accident of birth. And a lot of philosophers think that knowledge is incompatible with that kind of accidentality. Like, for example, if the clock next to you is broken, but you happen to look at it at just the right time so that it gives you the right reading, and so you form a true belief on the basis of a broken clock, that wouldn't really count as knowledge because you would be right just by accident. Okay, so that's how I think these bad method arguments are supposed to go. And what I'll just realize I've been talking for a while, so I'll just kind of try to keep this short. On slide 18, I just point out that we still have the same problem of self-defeat here. What will people like John Hicks say when we try to use this argument on them? Presumably they'll say, well, my beliefs weren't instilled into me from childhood. But of course, the reflective religious believer could say the same thing. So still, this argument is not targeting reflective religious believers. It's just targeting unreflective religious believers. But even then, I think there are problems. On slide 19, I say that premise 2 there doesn't follow from premise 1. Even if it's true that certain beliefs were instilled into me from childhood, it doesn't follow that the method that I used was unsafe or insensitive or my beliefs are true just by accident. And I think planning as place of birth counterexample works again. So my parents have just always told me where I was born. They told me I was born in Long Beach, California. Does it follow that the method that I used was insensitive or unsafe or that I'm right just by accident? Well, no, because my parents told me I was born in Long Beach. If I hadn't been born in Long Beach, they wouldn't have told me that I was born in Long Beach. So that method is sensitive. It seems like if my parents are trustworthy, it's a safe method. Relying on my parents' testimony is a good way to learn about the world. And it's no accident that they were right. I mean, they were there. They saw me born. They knew it was in Long Beach. And so it's no accident that they were right about that. And so when they told me about it, it's no accident that I'm right. So I don't think 2 follows from 1. And then if you go to slide 20, I say that even if you add the sort of counterfactual consideration, even if I realize like, oh man, if I'd been born elsewhere and else when, I would have formed false beliefs on this question. I don't think that that's going to show that my method was unsafe or that it violates the non-accidentality condition. And there I would just encourage your listeners to think about somebody who's lucky to have really good evidence. And in the paper, the example I use is a friend of Copernicus in 1515. So suppose Copernicus has really good evidence to think that heliocentrism is true, but he hasn't really shared it with the world. But you're a good friend with Copernicus and he shares it with you. So I think that you could know on the basis of that evidence that heliocentrism is true. But now ask yourself, or even if he just told you, even if he just like instilled that into you from childhood, now reflect on the fact that if you had been born somewhere else and at another time, you wouldn't have had that evidence and you would have believed that geocentrism was true. Does it follow that the method you used was unsafe or that you're right just by accident? I don't think so. I think that the method that you were using, relying on Copernicus, is a safe method. And it's no accident that you're right. He has really good evidence and arguments for heliocentrism. So yeah, I don't think that premise 2 is going to follow from the sort of considerations that the skeptic is bringing forth. And then also on slide 21, finally, the last thing to say about this argument is, so even if my religious beliefs were formed insensitively or unsafely, or they're true just by accident, this is kind of controversial, but I don't think that's enough to show that I would lack knowledge. I don't think any one of those conditions is actually necessary for knowledge. And there at the bottom of the slide, I mentioned some cases, which we can go through if you want. But there are counterexamples to all of those alleged conditions on knowledge. It's possible to know something even if the method you used was not sensitive to the truth. It's possible to know something even if the method you used was unsafe. And it's possible to know something even if you were right just by accident.
Yeah, let's save that. Actually, let me go ahead and switch screens here.